Hi, this is Mr. Ulrich, and this is Chapter 34 for AP World History. This chapter is entitled An Age of Anxiety. In this chapter, we're going to be covering the history of the world during the 1920s and the 1930s. We're going to be examining specifically the culture and the political influence of World War I on the subsequent 2 decades. This lecture is going to be in 4 different parts, with a different focus question for each. Section 1, we're going to be looking at the science and culture of the immediate post-World War I world. And we're going to be looking at this focus question. How did new discoveries in physics and psychology undermine earlier ideas about reality and knowledge? Remember that during the Renaissance, we looked at how scientific discoveries undermined religious dogma and how the world had to adapt to that. Well, in the 1920s and 1930s, we're going to be seeing similar discoveries in the areas of physics and psychology that are going to have some significant effects and are going to challenge people's preconceived notions of how the world works. Let's continue. So first we're going to talk about the lost generation. And the lost generation refers to a specific group of people. We're talking about Americans and Europeans. And this is a group of people who, as you read All Quiet on the Western Front, as we read that short excerpt from Mein Kampf, feel this sense of significant pessimism following World War I. They feel disenfranchised, they feel betrayed, they feel as though the world that they were promised is not the world that they have. And there's a disillusionment with Western culture. This idea of Western dominance, of Western superiority, is shaken by the lost generation. All the technological marvels of the 19th century kind of are challenged with the devastation and horror of World War I. And so we have writers such as Ernest Hemingway, writer of Old Man and the Sea, also The Sun Also Rises, as you can see from that quote to the right, who expressed that lamentation in both poetry and in literature. And there's this wonderful quote that I think summarizes the feeling of many in the lost generation on the right. Going to another country doesn't make any difference. I've tried all that. You can't get away from yourself by moving from one place to another. There's nothing to that. So the idea is that the lost generation is feeling broken and disillusioned, and a lot of that is internal at this point. They can't get away from it because where they're feeling it is from within. So there's this significant degree of post-war pessimism that comes about following World War I. Let's move on. We also see challenges to science and religion. And during the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, there's this feeling of perfectibility of man, that men can be perfected, that men are inherently good. That is part of that liberal thinking promoted by such people as John Locke, and seen in such documents as the Declaration of Independence and the Declaration of Rights of Man. But the 1920s and 1930s begins to question that, if that's actually the truth. They look at science and they look at quote-unquote progress as perhaps not all that it was sold to be. To the right, you have a famous picture from a trial that some of you might be intimately familiar with, which is the Scopes monkey trial, in where John Scopes was charged and convicted of teaching evolution in a public school in the United States. This turned into what was considered at the time to be the trial of the century. This was a trial that pitted science against religion. And there was a feeling that science was made people amoral, or made people, even worse, immoral. And that people, because instead of being inherently good, are inherently sinful, the technology exasperated those tendencies in human beings. And so we see this conflict again between religion and science that even continues to this day. We're going to keep going. And if you believe that people are inherently bad, then what does that say about a political institution where people rule, a democracy? Well, again, we see the technological horrors of World War I. And we also see the enfranchisement of women in Western Europe and in the United States. But you start to see intellectuals, part of this lost generation, concerned with how good is democracy really? Can it be trusted? And a fear of the rule of the inferiors, which is a concept that goes back to ancient Greece. And we see this quote from Plato, which says, "The good are unwilling to rule, either for money's sake or for honor. So they must be forced to consent under threat of penalty. The heaviest penalty for declining to rule is to be ruled by someone inferior to yourself. That is the fear, I believe, that makes decent people accept power." So the idea is maybe democracy, maybe people aren't as good as we thought they were. This is going to set the stage for what we see in Western Europe and the rise of fascism in the 1930s. But it's not limited to Western Europe, because this is also the era that we're going to see, for instance, the birth of the American eugenics movement. The idea of people aren't inherently good, but we can certainly try to make them better by, for instance, sterilizing people who seem to be less fit than others. Let's continue. We also see revolutions in physics and psychology. We see, for instance, a shattering theory that becomes popular and that you all are aware of, which is Einstein's theory of relativity, which is the idea that space and time aren't absolute, and in fact, they are flexible. The notions of space and the notions of time are not finite, definite concepts, that both space and time are flexible depending on, for instance, gravity. So to extrapolate that a little bit further, the reality that you and I experience is a mental construct. The idea of the passage of time is merely an illusion. The idea that you are a certain distance from me is merely a mental construction. This is, of course, can be psychologically devastating, because suddenly the idea of object permanence, the idea that a thing will stay in a place unless acted on because reality, is a bit shattering. We also see Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which is that if you have a particle and you try to measure its position and you try to measure its speed, you can do one, but you cannot do the other, because the observation of it will affect its position or its speed. So the idea being that you cannot observe something without affecting what it is. And so this creates a great deal of flexibility in the conception of reality. And so you take on that the horrors of the war, the sense of betrayal, the sense of disillusionment, and it creates this sense of nihilism. What is the purpose? Why do I even bother? With many in the lost generation, which adds to that concept of the feeling of rudderlessness that you all talked about on Friday. To continue, we also have psychology. You have Sigmund Freud, which, if you go back to Oedipus, explains a lot of Freud's theories. Oedipus Rex was a terrible mess, but at least he loved his mother. And as many of you have taken AP psychology, you know, probably better than I do, what is bulleted to the left. That there is conflict between the conscious and the unconscious. between the id and the ego and the superego, the parts of us that are driven by base emotions and our higher instincts. The idea of sexual arousal being and sexual repression being the basis for many of our mental issues. And we have this wonderful quote from Sigmund Freud talking about civilization itself. Life as we find it is too hard for us. It brings us too many pains, disappointments, and impossible tasks. In order to bear it, we cannot dispense with palliative measures. There are perhaps 3 such measures: powerful deflections which cause us to make light of our misery, substitute satisfactions which diminish it, and intoxicating substances which makes us insensible to it. So he said civilized life is painful and is full of disappointments, and so what we do is we change our perception of what satisfies us in order to cope with it. We deflect our misery. We aim our hostility not inward but towards some other direction. We have substitute satisfactions. So we're willing to, because we can't get the thing we really want, we're willing to live with something that's maybe not quite as good, but at least somewhat satisfying. And we are prone to intoxicating ourselves because that's a way of at least coping with the misery that we all live in. So these are, of course, very happy thoughts for a generation that is already quite happy. Moving along. And this is somewhat, we see this concept in art as well as architecture. To your right, you see the painting Guernica by Pablo Picasso. Guernica is an anti-war painting that was painted following the bombing of Guernica in the Castile region of, in the Basque region of Spain in 1937, at the behest of Spain by German and Italian forces. This is a powerful anti-war message. Here you see what is generally assumed to be the eye of God looking down on the world and the horrors of warfare, particularly on innocence. And just like with physics and psychology, there's this conception of what is reality and questioning what is reality. We also see in art the conception of, well, what is good art? What is bad art? We see a lot of experimentation, especially with concept of perspective, of linear perspective. And we see a great deal of experimentation. We see during this time period the emergence of what's called Dadaism. Dadaism, which is, in my humble opinion, almost silly art, but in almost the unart. And so, for instance, a famous piece of Dada artwork is a urinal that someone took off a wall and wrote the word Dada on it. It is now considered to be a famous work of art. And again, the idea being that there was no conception of what truly good art was. This is also reflected in the architecture of the time. You notice this building to the right, which was built during this time period. It is simple, it is functional, it is utilitarian, and that reflects the architectural styles of the time. The idea is that, again, the form should follow the function. And here's the function, and therefore the form should be equally purposeful. It is the absence of what we see during the Renaissance and afterward with large domes and columns and harking back to an age of Roman and Greek glory. Here we see something that is antithetical to that. It is simple, it is plain, and perhaps it is beautiful in its simplicity and plainness, but it is functional, and that is its purpose. Moving on. That's going to be the end of section 1. We're going to pick up next with section 2, which is going to talk about the economics during this time period, the perceived boom of the 1920s followed by the worldwide depression that is triggered by the American Great Depression.